Hello everybody, this is Mrs. Gabriel, and I'll be presenting about 50 slides to you on Unit 8, just 8.1 to 8.4 of aquatic and terrestrial pollution. The first topic is just sources of pollution and where pollutants may come from. Okay, so remember that we have our point source and non-point source categories of water pollution. We've talked about these before. In the picture that you see at the bottom of the slide, you'll see some point source pollution, which is coming out of two big outlets. And the stuff coming out of it is what we call effluent. Effluent is underlined in the slide, part of the slide up to the right. Let me see if I can turn my laser pointer on. Right there, effluent, E-F-F-L-U-E-N-T. So that is a point source because we know exactly where the pollution is coming from. So we could actually do water tests on whatever the stuff is coming out of there, and we can determine if whatever's coming out of there is also in the rest of this water. We can determine and then fine this company for putting stuff in this water that they shouldn't have. But because it's monitored, these companies have to have some type of filtering or pre-treatment going on before the effluent is even released back into the waterway. So the EPA is who monitors and sets the standards for water quality. The Clean Water Act is what helps them with the legislation by giving permits, requiring mitigation, and other strategies for mitigating the pollutant. And then our other point sources are listed in the bottom right of the slide. We've already talked extensively about CAFOs and how those are point sources for nutrients because too many nutrients are a problem. And then you have some other ones listed, so you can pause this and study them as you need to. So I just wanted to give you a real picture of effluent coming out of some type of pipe, and this just could be runoff from the roads that goes down a storm drain, and then that storm water just picks up everything along its way and it's being released into a stream. Or it could be released into a river, it could be released in a whole bunch of places. And then in the bottom picture, you see a whole bunch of cows that are on a field, and because they're on this field, it's more of a range of where this pollution could be coming from. We know that the cows can put excessive amounts of nutrients into the water from their poop. They can also create runoff problems by overgrazing, but we don't know exactly which cow and which location it may be coming from. We just have an idea. So this is like really a non-point source. So non-point sources, as I said, if you look in the part of the slide in the upper right corner, can just be runoff going down a storm drain. And this is certainly not it, this list of what can be going from suburban or urban areas down a storm drain, but this could be from work on your house, work on your car, work on your lawn. And all of that goes, every time it rains, goes downhill and goes into a storm drain in urban and suburban areas that have storm water and have drain systems. And then if you look in the picture to the left, we see some type of plane going over some kind of agricultural field, and it could be spraying fertilizers, herbicides, or insecticides. So when it rains or when the wind is really blowing, some of the chemicals from these things can just go right downhill or get dropped off into the waterways. And that accumulates in the water and becomes toxic. It could be at very high levels and can harm aquatic life, and it can create a problem with our drinking water. So these are not necessarily targeting a point source, but we know that these are ways that pollutants can get in there. So we do have to manage what landowners are doing to prevent getting this stuff to run downhill into our water. Then we also have a big problem with sediment. So there's three bullets here: construction sites, crop and forest lands, eroding stream banks. This is all anthropogenically caused reasons that we get more sediment into our waterways, which you're going to learn more about. But sediment, we've learned to death all year, includes our soil triangle. Think about that textured triangle, but sand and gravel and clay, all those small particles. And they also create a problem with the ability for plants to get the sunlight and little fishies and crabs to lay their eggs. So sediment is also considered a water pollutant, and it also could be non-point source. Your ideas to take away are listed in the bottom, and I gave you an example question from AP Classroom. So water pollution is anything that's going to affect the organisms that live in it or whoever consumes the water. That includes us. And water pollution can get polluted from anything physical, biological, or chemical. We will be testing these things in class. Physical things, biological things, and chemical things that can affect the organisms that live in it or affect the people that drink it, like us. And they can come from point sources and non-point sources. Okay, so you can pause this on your own, but these are the 2 essential knowledge statements that you need to know for 8.1. Okay, now we're going to work on 8.2, and this topic is on human impacts on ecosystems. This is a biggie. Make sure that you really take everything in. Good news, you've already learned some of it. We're just looking at it at a deeper level. So you have to be able to describe human impacts or impacts of human activities on aquatic systems. And one of the ones that you should really be focusing are coral reefs. So coral reefs are an aquatic system. And before I go to the next slide, let's just take a look at some of these pictures so you know what I'm talking about. So I know you know what a turtle is, and I know you know when we're looking at this that we're looking at coral reefs. What I'm not sure if you know is that all these things in this picture are animals. So we have our fishy, we have our turtle. I don't know why my laser isn't going on. And, oh, there it is. Okay, we have our turtle, we have a fishy right there, and then we have a fish over here. But all these things are different types of coral sponges, different types of animals. Animals. They are part of the animal kingdom. These are animals. And we're going to zoom in the picture to the right. And these little yellow things, there's a whole bunch of them, like all around the fish's head. There's a whole bunch. I need you to remember that these are also little animals that are part of this like animal colony, and they're called polyps. So you're going to learn about the polyps, and the reason you're going to learn about the polyps is because coral reefs have been suffering damage due to increasing ocean temperatures, runoff from sediment, and destructive fishing practices. And guess what? Those are all things caused by humans. Okay, so let's look a little more closely at that polyp that I was telling you about. And you can pause this slide and read all these things to yourself. So remember, coral is an animal. The interesting thing about polyps in coral, all those animals that are part of that colony, is that they're really a symbiotic organism. So it's, and it shows you right here, tiny symbiotic algae that live within the coral's tissues, and they give coral their color. They make coral solar powered because it's algae, so you know it's going to photosynthesize. And by that, it's then going to grow. And that energy provided by the plants are going to help the rest of the animal secrete that material to create a skeleton. So coral reefs are very productive. Lots and lots of animals, most of the animals in the ocean like to stop by and hang out and feed at coral reefs. And they cover a very, very small part of the ocean floor. But look, their habitat's at 25% of all marine life. So they're all very, very important. And remember what I told you about how humans are damaging them. So we'll learn about how they're damaging them in a few minutes. So I gave you another picture in the bottom right of a close-up of our symbiotic organism of our coral with the zooxanthella. And then you see another picture of a coral reef that looks like there's some coral bleaching going on in the background here. We'll talk about that in a later section of this unit. So what you do need to know about is sediment problems. So we've talked about sediment pollution in the last few minutes, but sediment can go all the way, run off into our streams, and then run off into our tributaries that then run into the ocean. And that sediment can then pile up and bury coral in the ocean, especially that coral that's closer to like a tidal zone. So once it starts covering it and burying it, it's going to block all the sunlight. And then you block the sunlight and all the algae in these little symbionts aren't going to be able to photosynthesize. So that's one way that we can lose our coral reef ecosystems. That's because of humans, guys, because of humans. So cloudy water from those particles in sediment that are not actually settling also can make the water so cloudy that the algae will not be able to photosynthesize there either. And just an FYI, I put it in pink for you, sediment pollution and that sediment building up and burying everything at the bottom can also happen in reservoirs and lakes and in channels of water where fish need to migrate and spawn. Okay, so I'm providing a picture here of what a coral reef should look like in the before and a coral reef after humans have created some type of damaging factor. And remember, the things that we can do are increasing the ocean temperatures, which we are doing through global warming, guys, and from thermal pollution, sediment runoff, which we've been talking about all year, and destructive fishing practices. So all those things can make the coral reef go from before to after. And remember, 25% of all living things in the ocean depend on coral reefs in order for that population or that percent of organisms in the ocean to survive. So high temperatures cause coral bleaching. Coral bleaching is the specific after picture that we're looking at here. And what coral bleaching is where that algae that's in the coral literally gets like spit out because the coral can't handle it. It literally expels it out of its cells, and then by doing that, it no longer gets any of the energy that it needs or its food supply. And remember that I told you that fishing practices are another reason that coral reefs are getting destroyed, and these are threats to coral reef ecosystems. So we've already learned about bottom trawling, and the picture that my laser printer is going over, you can kind of see how a trawl was dragged across the bottom of the ocean floor, and that's a fishing practice. And just debris and trash in the ocean is going to also create a problem for anything that lives there. And overfishing we've learned about a lot, so I don't need to explain that. But another one is cyanide fishing, and people that own aquariums that they want to make money off of in some way, aquarium shops, people that want to sell exotic fish on the internet, and yes, it happens all the time. They literally go diving, and in this little tank that he has cyanide, which is like a poison, and it stuns the fish or whatever they're trying, or the coral. It stuns it just enough where they can poison it so that the little tentacles don't kind of sting, because some of this stuff will sting, and it might give you like a little burn. And if you want to stun something enough where you can just grab everything, pull it off whatever it's attached to, and then bring it home and then sell it. Cyanide is apparently a thing. The problem is it also kills everything around it if it's too sensitive and can't tolerate it. Okay, this was from AP Classroom. I do not love the pictures that they put for teaching you range of tolerance, so I'm going to show you some that I stole and that I've used previously, like way earlier in this school year. But you do need to know for essential knowledge that organisms have a range of tolerance, and that range of tolerance also applies to pollutants. So temperature that's too high would be considered a pollutant. We're also going to look at some other ones in environmental conditions. But all organisms, remember, have an optimal range for them to maintain homeostasis. So we don't want to stress organisms out by changing their range of tolerance. Okay, here's the one that's my happy place. So this is what we went over earlier this year. So watch my laser. So we're looking at our preferred niche. So an organism that's living in this optimum range is within their range of tolerance. This is their very, very happy tolerance range. We can also go where they can live with a little stress, and that's less organisms that do well in here. So most of our organisms are going to do well in the preferred niche. Less of our organisms will do well in that marginal niche. They can handle some stress, but not all of them can handle the stress. So the optimal range is in the middle of our curve. And then our tolerance range is in the second set of bars in our curve. And then we become intolerant on the last set of our curve. And notice no organisms can survive there. So that's what we mean by range of tolerance. And remember that it's referred to with our niches, and we talked about that all year. So the two examples that they have on this chart are showing you pH. So we have a pH range that most organisms, and each species is different than another. So some might be like their perfect pH, and for an aquatic organism might be a pH of 6. And for others, the perfect pH might be a pH of 5.5. And then we just move in either direction. So the pH above it or below it is what's going to cause a little bit of stress physiologically. And then it'll get to the point where they can't tolerate it. So this curve is how many of those organisms in a population will survive. So same curve, different chart, because I think that this chart is likely to show up on your test, and I think it's a good one to really understand and be able to talk about. Now keep in mind that we do want to know what's on our X and Y axis whenever we're talking about what we see here. So here they're helping you out with showing you, well, okay, this is our population number. Not many organisms down here, lots of organisms up here. So when we're outside our range of tolerance, that means that the organism or that population of organisms is experiencing physiological stress. Remember that. And if they're experiencing stress, it's going to limit their growth. It's going to reduce their ability to reproduce. And if it's too stressful, they'll die. Okay, so organisms are also tolerant of a certain amount of dissolved oxygen. Now you can honestly say like high levels of dissolved oxygen is always going to be good. Lower levels of dissolved oxygen are where animals or even plant respiration, they still need a little oxygen, right? So we'll start with, I want to remind you about dissolved oxygen. These are things that we've learned before, but just to get a little recall, dissolved oxygen is usually reported in parts per million. It can also be percent, okay, parts per million. And we'll be using a device in here measuring dissolved oxygen soon when we do our water quality testing. So you'll see little fishies in this chart. And what this is showing you is we're going to have more fishies survive at around 9.0 parts per million of dissolved oxygen. That's how you report that. So most types of fish are not able to survive below a 5.0 part per million amount of dissolved oxygen. So our range could be for range of tolerance between here for different species of fish, but some are definitely more tolerant than others, and we'll learn about that very soon. So how do we know that? Well, we know this because of something called the oxygen sag curve. Now, I'm not going to show you this slide on the next one, but I'm going to show you a better slide. But you need to know, like, the description of the sag curve is it's a plot, and we're going to look at how much dissolved oxygen changes from a distance from a pollutant. So the sag curve is plotting the dissolved oxygen levels as it increases in distance from a source of pollution. So we're going to look at tolerance and intolerance of species on the sag curve. And then once again down here we see a range of tolerance for dissolved oxygen. Just to remind you, the dissolved oxygen is definitely something that species need to survive. I'm going to get to the sag curve, but I want you to see this stuff before I get to the sag curve. You need to understand what I just explained to you about dissolved oxygen and how it kind of moves with the water. So we're going to look at our colors here, okay, and notice that this is not in ppm, parts per million. This is milligrams per liter, okay? So we're looking at milligrams per liter of dissolved oxygen, and then the bluer we are, the more dissolved oxygen that's going to be in the water, okay? And the redder we are, the less dissolved oxygen that's going to be in the water. And remember, that means like it's too stressful and most organisms are going to die. Now we're looking at a map down here. And I wanted to show you this because this scale will work for this map. So if we're looking at stuff like nutrients, which you're going to in the sag curve in a minute, and let's just say that all the water is running off in this zone, right? If the water is coming out right here, it's catching runoff all from around this part of the state, and all that water's running off into a river, I won't specify anything with rivers and streams yet. We'll get there. So all the nutrients come out here. Well, this is what we know. We know that if we have really high amounts of nutrients here, it correlates to a lot of dead things. And we know that if we have lower amounts of nutrients here, it correlates to higher dissolved oxygen, which means more living things. So nutrients and dissolved oxygen seem to be related. Now what we're looking at in the red, where we've discovered there's low dissolved oxygen here and there's high levels of nutrients, this is what we call an ocean dead zone. So this ocean dead zone is where there's areas of low oxygen. It's a dead zone, and it's usually caused by the nutrients that are coming from all this runoff. Nutrients are running downhill into the ocean, and there seems to be a correlation between the nutrients and the dead zone and the low oxygen levels. All right, so remember, we're going to look at a sag curve, and the sag curve has to do with distance from a source, okay? And other things that I need you to know is biological oxygen demand, which is in purple, that is bad, okay? That's bad. Dissolved oxygen, which is in green, is good. Okay, so let's just start following our line for dissolved oxygen. And then remember that this curve is all about distance from a source, a pollutant source. So let's assume that effluent or runoff has put excessive amounts of nutrients in the water right here. Excessive amounts of nutrients. Well, those nutrients immediately start going downstream, traveling downstream. The nutrients are going downstream, and we're going to see a buildup. This is what they've learned. We're going to see a buildup of a change in dissolved oxygen and in nutrients, biological oxygen demand, and we're going to see a change in the organisms that are tolerant at each of these stages. So let's just go through, and I'll go through a couple other slides that explain this. So watch our green bar. Our dissolved oxygen levels are fine at first, and then we're increasing in concentration. Everything's building up. Plants are doing very well with all the extra nutrients. The problem is the plants start dying, and when the plants start dying, then we have other organisms that, like bacteria, that need to decompose the dead plants. So when those bacteria decompose the dead plants, they are using all the oxygen out of the water, and therefore the dissolved oxygen level is decreasing. Well, those bacteria taking all the oxygen out for them to be able to metabolize is called a biological oxygen demand. They're demanding more oxygen. So go ahead and follow the purple curve, pause it, and see where things drop, where things increase, and take a look at the organisms and what's changing. Look at your oxygen sag right here. Like we have hardly any dissolved oxygen here. And look at the organisms that are living here. Now let's look at another chart, and let's look at the actual name of each stage. So we have the clean zone stage. So that's like right around where that effluent was first put in, okay? So even before it. Then we have this decomposition zone, okay? So the effluent or whatever's running off like is all concentrating here. So in our decomposition zone, we have carp, which is a type of fish that's very tolerant. We have black fly and midge larvae. These are organisms that, and they're larva levels, so they're at a young stage of growth and development. They're very tolerant of this level of oxygen and BOD. And remember, we're looking at our oxygen is the solid pink line, our BOD is the dotted line, okay? So they're tolerant of the drop in dissolved oxygen. And they also put pictures of some of these. So this is black fly larva, this little wormy guy. And we'll be looking at pictures of this in class. Then we have our septic zone. So our septic zone, look what happened to our oxygen. We are really low in our dissolved oxygen. We're still incredibly high in our oxygen demand. And remember That's because we have other bacteria and organisms in there that are decomposing. They are very active, and their metabolism requires the use of all the oxygen, hence the biological oxygen demand. And then, as we get further and further away from the source, we are also decreasing in these other problems. So now we have a recovery zone. Now in the recovery zone, our dissolved oxygen might be good, but we still don't have the organisms that have that range of tolerance of the clean zone until we get even further away from the source. So this is an oxygen side curve, and it is a plot of dissolved oxygen levels versus the distance from a source. And it's usually excess nutrients and some other biological stuff that comes out of the effluent that causes the problems. So it's almost always about excess nutrients coming out of the source. Okay, so that was a doozy of information. Just take a look at your ideas to take away, and you can pause this and look at it on your own. Okay, we've been learning about oil. We use it for a whole lot of things. We are very dependent on oil. The problem is when we extract oil, we are not always super perfect at being mess-free. So oil spills are another threat to aquatic and terrestrial systems. Now, oil spills in marine waters cause organisms to die from the hydrocarbons in the oil. And oil that floats on the surface can coat the feathers of birds and the fur of marine mammals. Some oil will actually sink to the ocean floor, killing some bottom-dwelling organisms too. So it can create a problem all over the aquatic system. And oil that washes up on the beach can have economic consequences on the fishing and tourism industries. Now we have two pictures here in these slides. And the first one is of the Exxon Valdez spill that happened in Alaska in 1989. And it was the first big disaster that like really made worldwide news. And actually it happened because the captain of the ship was drunk. And they built these oil tankers where they didn't have a double hull, and now it's a law where they have to have a double hull. So it's basically layers in what's ever below the water. Layers to keep that oil in, because oil creates so many problems for marine organisms. It's devastating to marine organisms. And on the right, you'll see one of millions of pictures of the BP Deepwater Horizon drill rig that was in the Gulf of Mexico. That happened in 2010, so you guys were little ones at that time, and 180 million gallons of oil spilled. So this happened out in the Gulf of Mexico, and the other one happened up in Alaska, Pacific Ocean side, obviously. Okay? So as I told you, oil spills can impact wildlife, and I already told you what different ways it can impact wildlife. You need to know these ways. It can also impact the whole food chain. And remember I told you some of it can sink to the ocean floor. So that oil that sinks to the ocean floor can cause problems with any bottom feeders at the ocean floor. It's actually called oil blobs. And then we have the whole tourism and fishery industry that's impacted by any kind of oil spill. It's very sad. And remember, the big ones that you need to know, the big case studies, are the Exxon spill and the BP Deepwater Horizon. Okay, so I do think that you need to know where oil comes from. So if you look at the charts, we're looking at the chart on the left is just in North America, and worldwide is the chart on the right. So where does all our oil come from in the oceans? Well, you'll notice that there's a lot of it that's just naturally seeping out of little cracks and vents on the ocean floor. So there is a lot of oil already in the ocean, but it's been controlled by the ocean, right? And then in our country, about 30% of the oil that actually is in the waters is because of us consuming petroleum. And then there's a little from transportation and extraction. And then worldwide, you can see the transportation of petroleum. That's like the Exxon Valdez accident, guys. The transportation is like the ship, okay? So worldwide, we have had many less ship accidents that are carrying, like oil tankers, that are carrying oil than the rest of the world. So I guess kudos to us. But that's a lot of oil that's getting into the water, harming these poor little organisms. Now, I'm not going to show this video during my presentation. I don't think I can anyway. But I'd like you to watch it for, like, just skim through some of it at least, so you can actually see, like, in actual video footage what the oil looks like, the oil spills look like, and the impacts on the environment, on food chains, on fisheries, on the economy, and animal populations. Okay. We also have sediment issues, which I talked about like earlier in this part of the presentation. Remember that sediment is a non-point source pollutant, and I tried to give you some pictures here. So in the top one that my pointer is going over, you can see all the sediment in the water. Remember, sediment's just particles of like soil, clay, sand. The sand's going to sink more to the bottom. When you see this kind of floating stuff, you should know this from labs that we've done in class. That's usually clay. It doesn't settle, but it's going to make the water cloudy. And you know, as soon as that happens, that photosynthetic organisms are going to be able to do their thing. A lot of this comes from construction, poor management of construction sites, road building, farm fields, overgrazing. That's how the sediment just runs off every time there's a lot of rain. And then, if you look at the picture to the left, this is where the sediment is not a problem on the left, and this is where excessive amounts of sediment are going to cloud everything in here, and that creates a problem for producers and consumers and the food chain. And you can read all that on your own because I've been teaching you this a whole lot. So it's all about the light, photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is what adds our dissolved oxygen to the water, and then predators aren't going to be able to see anything. Animals aren't going to be able to lay their eggs. There's not going to be a nursery there, and there's not going to be habitat and shelter for the other fish. So in the Chesapeake Bay, let's find that. That's right here, Chesapeake Bay, Chesapeake Bay. Everything that's in light green is our Chesapeake Bay watershed. Now you guys should know this. This is one of the largest estuaries in the whole entire world, and it's got some major pollution problems. So nutrients is one of the problems, and chemicals and sediments. So this map really just gives us the boundaries of the Chesapeake Bay watershed because I wanted you to know that. You should be able to determine which states are included in the watershed. So remember, anything that runs into any of these rivers and streams and tributaries in the light blue like lines here is going into the bay. So we have places like, you know, a couple hundred miles away from the bay, and they're part of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So you need to know that the Chesapeake Bay has the same problems as most polluted waterways. Nutrients come from water discharge. It can come from sewage treatment facilities, from animal waste, from CAFOs, fertilizer from us watering our lawns, and it creates a major overpopulation of algae, and that can create an algae bloom. So algae blooms we'll talk about soon. And then the chemicals are also an anthropogenic problem with pesticides, even pharmaceutical drugs, and then sediments we've been talking about. And then just because I thought that you should see, this is our Maryland blue crab, and the population of crabs were going away because the sediment, all the sediment pollution in the bay was actually causing a loss of bay grass habitat. So the grasses could no longer photosynthesize because of the sediment, and then of course if they can't photosynthesize, they're no longer there, and then if the bay grasses aren't there anymore, then the crab is losing its habitat, and its gills were getting clogged, and it couldn't lay its eggs and have a safe nursery. You can read the ideas to take away on your own while I go to the next slide. So we also have a problem with heavy metals getting into our water. Now, heavy metals, such as the ones listed in blue, are used for industry, mining, burning of fossil fuels. Anyway, when we use these things, they can reach groundwater and they can impact our drinking water supply, which is a problem. And then I just copied this AP Classroom slide so that you can read some of the stuff that we have been and will be talking more about. So I'm about to show you a couple slides on how damaging exposure to heavy metals in our drinking water can be to human health. I really want you to think about, before this slide goes on, if you could think of a few different metals that were just listed and what kinds of health effects they would have that are negative. Okay, so we have lead that can come from erosion of old pipes still even today, and from the soldering of pipes that might have lead in the solder. So even though it might be a new building, some of the pipes can erode down to other metals that have lead in it. And it is a health threat that we'll get into, but it can be removed by water filters. Then we have arsenic. Arsenic can be found in rock. When we mine for it, it gets exposed. And it's also found in any wood preservative that makes like deck material last. So arsenic is really common in wooden decks that they put a protector on it on the wood before they even build the deck. So it can survive many more years to just the elements. And that has gotten into our water because it's been used so much in these preservatives. And when it gets into our water, then we drink it, and it could cause cancer of the skin, lungs, kidneys, and bladder. Then we have mercury, which we've talked about a whole bunch because we talked about it when we talked about air pollution and mercury getting in the air from burning coal. Well, that mercury can also settle out of the air and into our water. That mercury can also get into the water by us burning trash, burning stuff in our trash that contains mercury, and medical and dental supplies. Mercury also a little bit can come from the extraction of oil and manufacturing of cement, which you learned before. The big problem with mercury that we can get it from is by eating fish that mercury has bioaccumulated in from the mercury that got into the water. And then we've talked excessively about the acids, so I'm not going to talk about them. You know about the acids. And the acids definitely can break down other heavy metals like zinc, copper, aluminum. We've already talked about that. And then we have our synthetic compounds, which can have heavy metals in them. And heavy metals can be found in pesticides, pharmaceuticals, and hormones that you pee and poop and then go into our storm or our sewage treatment, but we don't remove all this stuff. So then when that water gets cleaned and gets put back into the stream or river, they can't pull every single contaminant out of the water. They just can't. Okay, so looking at arsenic. First, pay attention to arsenic concentrations in the key. So more arsenic is bad. More arsenic is bad. Now, arsenic causes cancer of the skin, lung, kidneys, and bladder. Causes cancer of things. Where is arsenic most concentrated in our country? Yeah, we've got a bunch of concentrations here. We've got a big bulb just like in north of Texas, and then California's got a whole lot of it. Remember, some of it can come from rock, right? It can also come from rock, and we don't have as much here, but it does exist. Okay, so this graph just shows us where mercury is produced most in the world. Asia, 54% of mercury, and now you know what mercury can do to you because you've been learning about it. And we still have some that's produced in North America. Then, I just want to show you, mercury is a big enough deal where we do have signs. Wherever there might be too much mercury that has bioaccumulated into the fish in a lake or a river. This is in Santa Clara County, California. That's where this sign is. Because there's so much mercury found in the fish because it's bioaccumulated into the fish that live in that water. I don't know if it's a lake or a stream or a river. Okay, and then we have our coal burning, probably a coal burning emission stack where our mercury can come out of. Looks clean, but that doesn't mean there's particulates. There's still some particulates in there. Can't clean them up entirely. And the next picture that just showed up was liquid mercury. This is mercury found at regular room temperature in its most elemental form. And we are not allowed to play with that anymore. It's dangerous. They took it all out of schools. Mercury is the symbol Hg, just so that you know. And then I'm going to talk to you a little more about how it gets into the food chain and bioaccumulates, but let's get our first introduction to that. We have mercury coming from a coal plant, in this example, follow the arrows, which converts then into methyl mercury through the help of bacteria. And then the krill, just think small organisms, bottom of the food chain, will ingest the methyl mercury. And then whatever eats the krill, such as a salmon or an oyster, is going to ingest each one of these little krill and accumulate a little more mercury. And then maybe a tuna eats a whole bunch of these little oysters, and the tuna will accumulate even more mercury, and it accumulates and accumulates and accumulates more until it's so dangerous that pregnant women are definitely told, do not eat much seafood. Okay, so you can go to this website on your own and learn more details about what I just explained to you, but let's follow my little laser real quick. So we have that methyl mercury right here, which is absorbed by our smaller organisms, including plants. Phytoplankton is plants. And then it just accumulates more and more as each organisms eat more and more of it. So we have our small fish, and now you can see our mercury in the fish. And then the bigger fish eat a bunch of the smaller fish, so we can see even more of the mercury. And then, I'm not really talking about methyl mercury, but it doesn't matter because it's going to harm you. And then we have our large fish, or in some cases, it's just a fish that has been living for many years, and they've accumulated more and more and more of this mercury. So why are they accumulating more and more? Because you don't poop it out when you're done. The mercury actually doesn't get metabolized by the tissue in the organism. So that mercury stays there while the rest of the organism that you ate is metabolized, broken down, and leaves the body. So mercury stays behind, and that is what bioaccumulation is. And then as we go through each food chain, so like this could be a bigger fish that eats more and more of the smaller fish, and it just accumulates and never breaks down and never breaks down. It stays in the tissue of the fish. Well, when we move from one organism to the next trophic level, that's biomagnification. So accumulation is it just never breaks down and leaves this organism. Magnification is it's moving up through the food chain. So the further up you are in the food chain, if your food web has a lot of mercury in it, you're getting higher concentrations in less time as the big kahuna or the big tuna. Okay, so now we're looking at the actual neurological damage and other effects that mercury has on humans. So this is like, now we know how you can get the mercury in your water and by eating things that live in the water, right? And also in the air. So mercury is bad, we know that. Well, why is it bad? What does it do to humans? You can read this list on your own. I'm not going to do all of it, but it deteriorates your nervous system. Deteriorates your nervous system. Now remember, I told you that mercury has to be converted by bacteria into that methyl mercury, but bacteria is not a problem in most waterways. And that methyl mercury is the part that's toxic and bioaccumulates. So remember, it causes lots of problems when humans ingest it because we don't break it down either. It will accumulate in the tissue of us also. We will not poop it out. We will not pee it out. It is toxic and causes these problems. And the more of it that you accumulate, the more toxic it is on your body. Okay, so litter can also reach aquatic ecosystems. And besides being ugly, we don't like seeing the poor turtles eat plastic and paper cups. We don't like, litter being wrapped around organisms. It can also create other health problems for these poor little animals. It can create intestinal blockage where they can't poop. It gets stuck in their intestines. It can create choking hazards, and it can just put toxic substances into the food chain, kind of like what we just talked about. Another big one that's been making the news a lot in the past decade is microplastics. So these used to actually be in some of our soaps, and they would use it for exfoliating beads. Well, now they know this was just going down the drain, and then we were finding it accumulated with BPA and other bad chemicals. It accumulated in aquatic organisms, and then we ate those organisms, which isn't good because BPA, right here, BPA, bisphenol, And other polymers are actually harmful to aquatic organisms and to human health, also harmful. Okay, so you can read the ideas to take away on your own, and there's another multiple choice question. I like this one because they give you a scenario to read, which is similar to a lot of the questions you'll see on the test. So that was only 8.2. That was it. We just covered only 8.1 and 8.2. This was a doozy. So you're going to pause this on your own, and you're going to make sure that you can add something more to each of these essential knowledge statements. Just what else can you add that's very specific? And if you can't, then look back on the slides on your own. Okay, topic number 3 is endocrine disruptors. What are they? Okay, so an endocrine disruptor is a synthetic chemical. It's something made by humans. That's what you need to remember. An endocrine disruptor is something that's, when humans have done something with it to get into our food supply, okay? So where do these things come from? Before you learn about all the damage they do, where do they come from? Well, if you look at the list, I'm not going to read it all to you, but the one that I really like to focus on, the two that I really like to focus on, are pesticides and fungicides. So there's a lot of endocrine disruptors on these things because we use them in order to kill organisms that are on our food. So if it's on your food, it's been sprayed on your food, and you eat that food, then you're getting the endocrine disruptors that have been used to spray the food to get the pests and the fungus off of them. Some endocrine disruptors are also in a lot of the plastics that we use to eat with or that babies play with. So BPAs are endocrine disruptors and phthalates are endocrine disruptors. So we also have some natural endocrine disruptors, and they can be found in soy products. So soy milk, soybean, and just plain soy that people use for cooking. So what do we define it as? It's a chemical that interferes with production of hormones, transport of hormones, metabolizing hormones, or even just the function of hormones in our body. So some of the hormones that you might recognize are here, like estrogen and testosterone. And endocrine disruptors can disrupt how they work. So guys, I'm even careful about the water bottles that I use. So any plastic bottle, you should not use plastic bottles. And if you do use plastic, you should make sure that the plastic is BPA free. It should be newer, because a lot of the newer plastic bottles, like that are not bought necessarily at the dollar store and from another country that might not have any rules on this, then those water bottles usually will not release these endocrine disruptors. We do not want endocrine disrupting chemicals in our air, in our food, in our drink. So other ways that we can reduce our exposure to endocrine disruptors are here, and this is the one that I just told you about, avoiding the plastic bottles and even canned goods that have BPA. So if it says BPA free, you know that you're probably good. A lot of our makeups and perfumey products actually have endocrine disruptors in them. It's similar chemicals that they put in those pesticides and fungicides. And you can buy BPA-free shampoo and conditioner, because if you're inhaling it or you're ingesting a little of it, it just builds up. And remember, it messes with the function, the proper function of your hormones, Sunscreens have a lot of endocrine disruptors in them, which is why a lot of companies now, if you're going on a tour where you're going snorkeling, they don't want you wearing just any old sunscreen. You'll have to wear their sunscreen that does not put these endocrine disruptors into the aquatic system, because it's really bad also for the little fishies and animals that live there. So remember, endocrine disruptors, read all these things while I tell you, can interfere with the endocrine system of animals, which includes us and fish and frogs and any animal you can think of. They can lead to birth defects. They can lead to developmental disorders. They can lead to gender imbalances in fish and even other species. Now, one of the things that we should be a little concerned about are that endocrine disruptors are persistent, which means they don't break down. once they get into the soil or into the air or into the water, they hang out for a long time, creating damage. They don't get into the water and then break down. And they're everywhere. We just find them everywhere. So this diagram here is showing you how, and this one also right here, which was also on the AP Classroom site, is just showing you kind of how normal hormones and normal hormone receptors actually get disrupted by these endocrine signals, okay? So everything's here. I want you to look at this, and I'll just kind of tell you what it says here while you look at the images to try and take it in. Endocrine disruptors can mimic the structure of signaling. It's a chemical that would normally bind with a cell receptor to trigger a cellular response. Endocrine disruptors can also block the signal from reaching the receptor. Consequences include reproductive abnormalities, birth and developmental defects, and possible behavioral changes. Okay, so remember that endocrine disruptors are chemicals that can interfere with the endocrine system of animals, and they can lead to birth defects, developmental disorders, gender imbalances, all kinds of other issues. So if we eat predatory fish, if we eat them, and they have ingested endocrine disruptors that do not break down in their body, they're going to bioaccumulate, and they can biomagnify moving through the trophic level. So if you eat a top predator fish that has been eating smaller fish that ate smaller fish that ate even smaller little organisms, and they were ingesting endocrine disruptors, then when you eat that fish, you're going to accumulate very high levels of those endocrine disruptors. So the idea is to take away or down at the bottom. Remember, bioaccumulation and biomagnification are two different things. Bioaccumulation is in one organism or one organism level. Biomagnification is when that endocrine disruptor, in this case, moves through the food chain. And then we have in the purple, we have a slice of a testicle. So literally a testicle on a smallmouth bass, which is a type of fish, was sliced. And then if we look at that cross section of that slice, you can see that this was a boy smallmouth bass, okay? Testicles on boys. The boy smallmouth bass actually has eggs, not sperm, present in these gonads. Gonads are testicles, okay? Eggs are present. So what we're looking at are eggs, not sperm, in a testicle. So we do know that this also happens to humans. So humans are affected by having less sperm. And this is all because of endocrine disruptors. And of course, we also know that because we've exposed fish to the endocrine disruptors on purpose in a very experimental setting, like in a tank. 2 tanks. One tank has the fish that don't get exposed to all those endocrine disruptors. Another tank does. And then we find these types of health impacts. Okay, I'm not going to read the essential knowledge statements to you. Make sure that you pause, read them, and can say more. The last thing I need to review for this section is wetlands and mangroves and how they are impacted by humans. Do you know the difference between a wetland and a mangrove? Okay, so wetlands are shown in both of these pictures here. And basically all a wetland is something that has an area of land that has water covering the soil or water covering near the surface of soil for all or most of the year. So you walk on these grassy patches and you're walking in like watery grassy paths. Like it has like, these are like tall grasses that are aquatic grasses. They're aquatic grasses. So apparently you really just need to know that we have like different types of wetlands. Mangroves are a type, or are like a type, and we have coastal or tidal wetlands, and then we have inland and non-tidal wetlands. So coastal and tidal, which is what we're looking at right up here in the right corner picture. So that might have a little salinity in it, and the salinity is going to change as tides come in, tides roll out, or more runoff comes in from the land. So there is a little salinity in a coastal wetland or a tidal wetland. We have a lot of coastal tidal wetlands in Chesapeake Bay. And then we have our inland or non-tidal wetlands. We actually have quite a few of these around here too. Smaller wetlands that are on the inland might be near lakes or ponds. They might be swamps. You've probably heard of swamps. We have some in Harford County, some areas that just look like swamps. Well, it's a type of wetland. We have wetlands in Harford Glen also. So they're usually along rivers and floodplains. They're going to be in lower topography, lower areas of the land where everything runs downhill, and like I said, near lakes and ponds, and they're going to change with the season. So wetlands do some pretty amazing things. They provide lots of ecological services, and some of those ecological services include purifying water. That means cleaning the water, filtering the water. They make it cleaner and nicer for everything else in the ecosystem. These are ecological services. They also protect us from flooding, or the ecosystem. They kind of slow down water. We'll learn about that. And they filtrate that water, and they provide an incredible habitat. So if you look at what I have in the purple and the green, I gave you more information on how they maintain water flow. So like in dry seasons, they'll just keep that groundwater recharged and they hold it in. So anytime there is runoff, they'll recharge. It's like a recharge site. A wetland is like a recharge site. And they hold that groundwater in and they release it nice and slow. And they control flooding, so any water that's running into the wetland, because of all that vegetation, gets more slowly released into other streams in the environment. And that means we're going to have much less erosion because the wetlands and all that vegetation has slowed down everything that came into the wetland. Even the rainfall, runoff, and extreme rainfall, the wetland is just going to slow it all down before it gets released into other streams and rivers. And then, well, not rivers, streams, it's going to be streams. And then our coastal shorelines, any wetland that's on a coastline, if a hurricane comes in or severe storms come in, it actually protects those strong erosion-capable waves from coming inland. So it just holds it back, it slows down, and it acts as a barrier for all that bad, dangerous, moving water. And then remember I told you green, 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 that they improve water quality by filtration. So they give the sediments time to settle because they slow down that water. The plants, so many plants, they actually grab and hold on to those pollutants, and then the plants will use the pollutants or they'll actually take the pollutants up. We can talk about that in another, when we go into another section. So microbes in the wetlands will also take up those excess nutrients, and the soils trap the pollutants also. The soils in the wetlands are amazing. Remember, I told you wetlands provide ecological services. They include water purification, flood protection, water filtration, and they provide tons of habitat. So in green, we're looking at more of what I already told you from the last slide. And then we have the blue. They increase biological activity. So the green was from the last slide, and then I gave you another picture of a wetland that is an inland wetland. And then in blue, wetlands increase biological activity. They are the most productive ecosystems on the planet. They are so important. They have shallow water, like it's not like you can go diving off a wetland, off a boat into a wetland. You're going to hit bottom real quick. You don't ever dive in a wetland. They have so much habitat and so much diversity, And migrating animals always like to stop over into wetlands because there's so much available in the food web and for habitat and protection while they migrate. And like I said, their soils are amazing, which is part of why so many plants can grow in them. So lots of plant diversity, lots of plant abundance, lots of species diversity, and lots of species abundance. So make sure that you study your ideas to take away that I just explained to you with lots of pictures that were borrowed from the internet. And I just want to make sure that you do remember that wetlands are where water covers the soil part or all of the year. Now the picture that we're looking at here, these are mangroves. So I think mangrove trees are really cool. So this is in a tidal wetland. So remember that's going to have a little salinity to it because tidal is going to be like coastal, right? These things are great when big storms come in. Look at these big trees in the picture. These are mangroves though. So lots of habitat available. I actually went snorkeling in one of these. It was amazing. I was actually a little scared because there were all kinds of, I was in Puerto Rico, and there were like all kinds of fishies that were swimming around me in every direction, just swimming right around me. There were so many different types of fish and eel that were all around in these wetlands, and there were so many different types. The abundance and the diversity was crazy, crazy. So these are very productive ecosystems, mangrove wetlands, very productive ecosystems. And remember, they're usually going to be more coastal. Human activities have severely hurt the mangrove ecosystems because we cut them down. We cut them down because we want to use that space for whatever we're developing. They also are sensitive, just like coral reefs, to overabundance of nutrients that go into the waterways here. And then you're going to learn all about what happens with the overabundance of nutrients and with eutrophication. So these, from what you can see and what I'm telling you, they're really shallow. So like I said, I went snorkeling, not diving. I could touch the bottom, and I was like literally like crawling but floating while I was snorkeling along the mangroves here. So, I mean, I was probably in no more than 2 or 3 feet of water here, but it's just big enough to show you that any strong, powerful waves or storms, the land behind this mangrove wetland is going to be very protective from any type of erosion or any type of storm damage that would come from the water. They also absorb 4 times the carbon dioxide that a regular forest on land does. That's huge. So as I said, development is one of the big threats to wetlands. So we even take down wetlands. We've done it in Harford County. We've taken them down in order to put a building or a road up. But luckily, we have the Wetland Protection and Restoration Act. So if a wetland has been damaged because of anthropogenic causes such as road building, the company, let's say, that built the road or that put the building in is now required to either put a man-made wetland that was the same size or bigger anywhere nearby, and they had to pay for the whole thing. And we actually have a massive man-made wetland right on Mount Royal Avenue, about 1/4 mile north of Aberdeen High School. Massive man-made wetland to make up for development that has happened in Aberdeen in the past like 30 years. So the Wetland Protection and Restoration Act is part of what is in place to protect us, or to protect our wetlands, because they are that important. Overfishing is also a problem with wetlands, and losing our diversity in them. And animals and birds that need to go to wetlands for migration are also at threats from us taking down wetlands. And then I told you about excess nutrients. So too many nutrients going into a wetland, although they're really great at filtering those nutrients, there's also a point where the tolerance is too high and eutrophication can happen there too. So wetlands that are near CAFOs are at the highest risk of that. And then, oh, by the way, what we're looking at in this picture on the bottom is of a manure lagoon at a CAFO. So if this thing, just a big rainstorm comes in and it overflows, any wetland nearby is going to be exposed to too many nutrients. So I gave you some practice questions in pink, and the answers were all in the last slide. So you can pause and ask yourself. And then another really good practice multiple choice question on AP Classroom and the ideas to take away. That is the end of us covering, that's the end of us covering 8.4 on human impacts on wetlands and mangroves. Here are your essential knowledge statements. And that's the end of this section. Have a great day. This is Mrs. Gabriel signing out.